Okay, I'm back with podcast 2. We were on, I'm sorry I didn't put the numbers on the slide, so I actually should do that before I upload them. We're on slide number 9, which was the collage of a bunch of different slides and a bunch of different satellites. And now I'm going to go to another collage with 4 pictures. On the left is a satellite mounted onto what looks like a round plate with a technician above it. And that round plate is actually the interface between the satellites and the rocket. The rocket is sort of hidden behind it in black. And I think I mentioned this in class. It was kind of an illegal picture I took because you're not really supposed to use a camera when you're, 2 meters away from 30,000 kilograms of solid, propellant rocket engine. But on the other hand, there's lots of lights in the room and people moving around. And, anyway, it was, our first real satellite in the company. And I wanted to, have some sort of a record of it, and nobody was taking any pictures of anything. So anyway, it's a picture of that satellite. Same satellite with the guy standing next to it in the clean room suit. And the other 2 things that are on here, there's a picture of the satellite hanging from the ceiling. It's not really the satellite, it's a cardboard model of the satellite that went into the Los Alamos National Lab Museum on Trinity Drive. And but it's a lifetime, life size model. So it gives you the idea of how big it was. And one of our employees standing next to the ground station antenna, which we built on the roof of the PI's building. This was totally radical back then. The idea that we weren't using the Air Force tracking network and that they would bring data down to Albuquerque or, White Sands Missile Range or something. And then days later, the scientists would get it after it had been scrubbed by the Air Force. Nothing like that. They had a little, antenna, which was actually a NOAA weather satellite receiving antenna, and which you can buy fairly inexpensively, and we handled mounting it to the roof. And then right next to his head, you see a little cylinder. That's the uplink transmitting antenna. And, it was very informally done, very easy, and became like a Macintosh computer compared to the old-fashioned computers. The scientists could run the satellite by themselves and didn't need us. And they didn't need White Sands. And I had worked on missions, particularly missions that were having problems where the data was coming from White Sands. By the time we got the data, it was already old. Many times they had to fly it over to us in California from New Mexico. And it was quite often squiggly lines on, looked like an EKG or something like that. So, we were trying to move, space into at least the 20th century. It seems trivial now, but space is one of the most conservative businesses. Why I went into it. It was badly in need of engineering, even engineering that I could do. You know what I mean? It wasn't, maybe, I'm not the super most, high-powered engineer in the world, and maybe I picked the low-hanging fruit in a way. I thought, look, these guys are doing stuff that nobody's doing anymore. Marginally contemporary technology would be a breakthrough if we can figure out how to get space people to do it. So miniature satellites became the vehicle because they're cheap. And because they're cheap, people would take chance. And they're cheap and they're a little invisible. They don't put a Ariane rocket, hundreds of millions of dollars on the launch pad to launch our little AMSAT cube. The mission is Spot Image, the French company, French nationalized company. And we're being nice guys and we're launching a couple of these toys. And inside of our toy, we could pretty much do whatever the hell we wanted to. So we were flying, batteries from cell phones and homemade, mass storage devices. And, we were doing it was a lot of pressure because we had to build everything ourselves because there was nothing in space that was cheap or low cost. And it really had to work. I mean, if it didn't work, it was going to be a total indictment of the small satellite movement. So we were, we got into the component business, and it's still that way a little bit. Now you can go to CubeSat Shop and places like that on the internet, and, you find things like these sun sensors that are available to purchase, but, they're fairly costly if they have flown before. Just one more satellite to illustrate how behind the times things were. One of our radical ideas was to build an entire satellite on one circuit board, which is pretty much everything in the consumer world. A laptop computer is a computer on a circuit board. A cell phone is a phone on a circuit board. I mean, we don't, in the real world, we don't make things, especially in the consumer world, that have multiple circuit boards. Remember the IBM PC-AT had like 6 circuit boards and a backplane, and the cards plugged into the backplane, and you could swap out the video driver card, or you could swap out the mass storage card or whatever. Sure, I mean, that was 1980. But, since then, things have been shrunk down, and we got so much slack for that. Oh, but if you put the radio on the same board as the computer, the radio is going to interfere with the computer. And yeah, but we've solved those problems, in other places. So anyway, those were, maybe I'm a little bit apologizing. The things that we did nowadays seem trivial. Like, isn't that kind of obvious? Well, now it is kind of obvious, but everything, as I like to say to people in my Crossing the Chasm class, everything that you see in the grocery store crossed the chasm. White bread in a plastic bag crossed the chasm. There was a time when there wasn't plastic, and there wasn't white bread, and there wasn't white bread in a plastic bag. Whose idea was that? And I'm sure when they first brought it up, it was like, hey, guy, this is a really stupid idea. People don't go to the grocery store to buy bread. They go to the bakery to buy bread. And this is inferior bread. And it's icky to have it in plastic. Who would buy this? If you're used to living in France or in Italy where everybody goes, down the stairs in their apartment building, and every apartment building is like steps away from a bakery, and they smell fantastic in the morning, and you're used to just going down there and picking up your piece of bread and bringing it up and, putting Nutella on it or whatever and having breakfast. The idea of eating white bread in a plastic bag is like, why would anybody do that? And yet, it's a default now. Everybody walks down the aisles of the grocery store and pulls one of those off the shelf and puts it in their basket. Go to the grocery store and see how much shelf space. Maybe you don't do that. And you say, look, nobody really does that. Oh, yes, they do. The grocery store doesn't take up feet of shelf space from floor to ceiling filled with bread in plastic bags because nobody's buying it. So, everything has to cross the chasm at some time. It's easy to be disrespectful of the past, I guess. So the interesting thing, the photo on the right is taken from the roof of our building. That's where our ground station antenna was. And it's a pretty impressive location. We can go up there and take a picture of the class, standing in front of the Coliseum. So it's, at least these are a bunch of my students, et cetera. So, okay. The reading. This was already in the homework assignment. I usually don't do homework in the podcast, but I thought you'd have it written down, Space Mission Analysis Design, and the editor, Jim Wirtz, who I sort of went to war against him, but the guy was, I don't know how much older than me he was. He did his PhD at Stanford the year that I entered Brown. So probably 10 years older than me. Super nice guy. You can see his picture there. He always had a pink shirt and a flower tie. And he ran a company which still exists, and he still exists, in Los Angeles, just down the street from SpaceX, but that was long before there was SpaceX, with that name, Microcosm. And his concept that he did his PhD on was the microcosm, that you could control the attitude of spacecraft by looking at the stars, looking at the moon, looking at the Earth, looking at the sun, looking at maybe the other planets, having in the computer's memory a model of the Newtonian universe, how everything goes around the sun. So therefore, if you know what time it is, you know where everything ought to be. You can make a mental map of how the solar system should look at that given instant in time. The moon should be over here, the Earth should be over here, Venus should be at this angle from the Earth, Mars at this angle from the Earth, etc., etc. And therefore you know where you are in space. You're sort of navigating by the stars. We know where the stars are. So if we look up and we see, the North Star is over here and Betelgeuse is over there, pretty soon you know where you are. And you're sort of triangulating off of fixed points. So Jim Wirtz was saying the solar system is filled with points that move, but if you have a clock, then you know exactly where they were at that instant in time when you looked out to see all the angles. And you create this microcosm. And that was his company. His company was basically a guidance, navigation, and control company. And like I said, he was a super smart guy. A lot of very interesting people traveled through that company. And he also wrote a lot of books. And he ran a book publishing operation. And so anyway, it was kind of the Los Angeles milieu in the 1980s when I lived there. And Jim was one of the people in our world. Another person in our world wrote chapter 17 of the SMAD book. And this is one of the reasons I'm very allegiant to the older SMAD book, because I worked for Bob Sackheim at TRW. Bob Sackheim was part of the crew that built the first rocket that went into orbit. He was an Army grunt working in Florida, and he was the guy who told me the story of the 12 failures in getting into orbit with Pioneer on the 13th launch, and that they didn't know what the hell they were doing. And he was a real creature of the 60s, crew cut, Corvette, and all that kind of stuff. And he was, the head of propulsion at TRW. And in fact, his boss, Dan Golden, became the head of NASA. So the total head of NASA, which was kind of fortunate because I had gotten to meet him in California through Bob. It's a few meetings with the three of us in his office. So he knew me, and he was a cyclist, and we would get together sometime, and he would yell at me about how I wasn't doing good enough. But anyway, Bob, was the head of the team that built the lunar module descent engine, which is also that LEMD, which is a modulatable engine, that makes the soft landing on the moon. And of course, they don't have two engines. It's funny because it's also the lunar module ascent engine. That's the engine that has to restart to get them off the surface of the moon. Him and one other guy were the two people who ran that program. And Bob is just a super serious, super, old school, definitely. He became the head of NASA in Huntsville, which is the propulsion NASA Marshall Space Flight Center, and he was always one of my mentors, and we would work together mostly on failed missions or failing missions. Put a satellite in orbit, it's having trouble. We worked together on the rescue of the TDRS. The first TDRS had problems. There was a classified Air Force satellite that had propulsion system problems. If they were propulsion system problems, he got on it, and I was a person who he knew he could rely on, and he would bring me in as a young guy, to do, basically, grunt work. Or, it wasn't totally grunt work, but, I was working for him. He was more the executive side, and he was definitely him who was presenting, to the Air Force. Here's, every morning you'd be doing a briefing. Here's the status of saving your satellite, that kind of thing. And then The Logic of Microspace, my book that I'm happy to hear is still out there someplace. The next slide is actually getting slightly technical. It's 3 pictures, very slightly, but bear with me because I'm, getting there now. 3 pictures of 3 satellites, all scaled in the picture to be the same size. So when you look at them, the satellites look to be about the same size in my picture, right? So, in fact, they're not the same size. The big one is, is a 5,000 kilogram class geosynchronous communications satellite, which you can kind of tell because communications satellite, well, let's not get into all the details yet. The number 2 in the middle is Clementine, another one of my missions that I didn't have a whole lot to do with, but, I worked a little bit on the propulsion system, which turned out to be, through no fault of mine, thank God, the thing that killed that mission. But it didn't kill it before it was in the final phases of the mission anyway. So we were doing the sort of, super risky stuff. But Clementine was the first satellite to hint at the existence of water under the surface of the moon in the regolith. And because it had certain, I'm not, the guy to talk to you about the science on that mission. But it was a medium-sized satellite, a few hundred kilograms. And then on the right is MSAT, built in Japan amateur radio. And you can see, because the guy's got his hands on it, how small it is. Nowadays, we would not consider that small, but at that time it was small. And the interesting thing that I wanted to bring up is to look at the solar panels of these 3 satellites. The AMSAT satellite has solar panels just the very simple way like Telstar had, like Pioneer had, bolted onto the outside of the structure, nothing moving, just the outside surface is solar panels, which, is the easiest way to put solar panels on a satellite. Clementine has the second easiest way, which is you basically launch it with the solar panels wrapped around the body, and then they open up like a skater's arms would open up in space, and you have, quote unquote, deployable solar panels. On the other hand, a geosynchronous satellite has a lot of solar panels. You can count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And those, we used to have a toy when I was little called Click Clack, which was a bunch of little plates of wood attached to each other by little ribbons of cotton in the natural world. As my father used to say, he never understood Whole Foods because when he was little, everything was natural because, insecticide and fertilizer hadn't really been invented yet. So he said, we created this great problem so that we could have Whole Foods to take it all away from us again. But anyway, so that's the Click Clack toy, and so it has so many solar panels that it's more than you could just wrap around the body. You actually have to have multiple solar panels stacked up one against another to generate enough. What are solar panels? They're intercepting sunlight and turning some percentage of that into electricity. And so how you handle the solar panels depends on how big your satellite is. And why is that? Because as a satellite gets bigger, its linear dimension, let's say, goes up by a factor of, to pick a canonical number that we all know how to multiply, 3. Let's say you make it 3 times bigger. You go from 1 meter to 3 meters to 10 meters, roughly. Kind of like logarithmic, to the base 10 scale. Okay, so 1, 3, 10. And the area of the solar panels, if you put them on the body, would go up like the square of 1, 3, 10, which would be 1. Let's go with 10 instead of 9. 3 squared is about 10, and 10 squared is about 100, so you're about 1, 10, 100. The area ratio. So, hey, you could say, what? On my big satellite, which is only, 10 times bigger in linear dimension, I'm getting 100 times more solar panel area. So that's really good, right? And the answer is no, it's not good enough. Because the volume inside the satellite is going like the cube, right? So the cube, now, my little round number game sort of breaks down a little bit. The cube of 3 is 27. So Clementine uses about 27 times more power than the Japanese amateur radio satellite, which is about true. The Japanese amateur radio satellite was sort of a 10-watt satellite, and Clementine was like a 300-watt satellite, right? And the big satellite, which is the 1, 2, 3, then you take, 3 squared is 9. Oh, did I do this wrong in my head? I was doing the area. No, I'm doing the volume now, right? So we're talking about volume, right? The area is going 1, 3, 10. The size is going 1, 2, 3. The area is going 1, 3, 10. And the volume is going 1, 3 cubed, which is 27, and let's say 10 cubed. Right, which is 1,000. So what you're really saying is that the big satellite, the geosynchronous satellite, consumes about 1,000 times, which is about right. That little AMSAT was like a 10-watt satellite. If you look at Sirius XM satellites, the direct broadcast, that sound all that music programming down all over, North America, they are the most powerful geosynchronous satellites, or were when they were launched. 10 kilowatts, 10,000 watts, exactly that number. So if you look at the ratio of the power required to the square of the linear dimension, the big satellite has big problems. It has a huge volume compared to its surface area, and therefore it has a huge appetite because the volume is where all the electronics are. You have 1,000 times more volume. 1, 2, 3, 3 squared, 3 cubed, you're going up to 10 kilowatts versus 10 watts, so you're looking at 1,000 times more volume, 1,000 times more power required because you have 1,000 times more circuit mass. If you want to think of it that way, it's like the human being. The more you weigh, the more your caloric input needs to be to keep all those cells alive every day. And if you start moving, it's just the same thing because you've got to move all that mass around. So heavy people burn up a lot more than light people. So anyway, the bigger you get as a satellite, the more deficit you have in surface area to volume ratio because the surface area is going up like the square and the volume is going up like the cube. And so without knowing anything about the linear dimension of a satellite, you can know whether it's big, little, or small depending on how the power works out. AMSAT has their little AMSAT satellites, which were small, have more than enough power. And this is an interesting thing because I was always criticized. Those little satellites don't have much area. Therefore, they don't have much solar panel area. Therefore, they don't produce much power, so therefore they're useless. Well, useless is a value judgment. What's not a value judgment is, in terms of surface area per unit volume, I used to say to people, we can only make 10 watts, but we have trouble using it all. We have no power problems. It's you guys with the big satellites that have to do all the gymnastics to deploy these gigantic arrays because you're hurting for power because you're an elephant. And elephants have ears because without their ears, they can't radiate their metabolic heat away. We don't need ears like that because we're smaller, so our surface area compared to our volume is much bigger. And when you get really small, you better be furry or you're going to freeze to death, or you got to be cold-blooded because you're so dominated by the outside temperature that either you do what snakes do and just live at the temperature of the outside, or you hibernate, or you get furry, to protect yourself, or you run. Birds are in a way furry because the feathers and everything really protect them, or you just run your metabolism at an incredible rate, which, kind of disadvantages you from a ecological evolutionary point of view because if you don't catch food, you die right away, which is a little bit the way humans are. Humans, if they don't find food, we can't go a long time because, we have relatively large surface area to our volume. We can't just be cows and, elephants and lie around, content that we're going to, be okay. So the smaller you get, the more surface area you've got to contend with relative to your size. Okay. The other thing about small that I noticed, I made this slide, a long time ago, as you can see, because it runs out in 1995, is that, Moore's law made electronics lighter and lighter and lighter, while the satellite masses were getting heavier and heavier and heavier. And I was the guy running around saying, that's not logical. Why should that be? We can now build, in 1/10 of a kilogram, what just a few years ago took 1,000 kilograms. So how come there aren't a lot of small satellites in the world? There should be lots of small satellites in the world because now, we built a few small satellites back in the day. We built Pioneer and all that kind of stuff, Vanguard. But all of a sudden, the only thing that is valid is Hubble, And I'm saying, gee, we did Hubble at a time when, the payload mass had gone down by 3 or 4 orders of magnitude. We should be building mini Hubbles that would be, 1,000th that size. And there were a million arguments were made about why that didn't make sense. But now it does make sense. That was the other argument for small. Okay, here's another argument for small on the next slide. This is a slide repeating the picture from the Ariane launch, along with the spot structure. And I think there's actually a typo on that because it says Ariane 4 fairing, but I don't think it was Ariane 4. I think it was Ariane 1. And that's a little bit of confusion because there was you can see that this slide's pretty old because I have a start here from 2013. But this is kind of basic stuff. There's another subtlety to scale. And this matters. You might say, well, Rick, that's all very interesting about linear area, surface area, and volume, which is maybe handy if you're going to take, heat transfer, right? Cooking a turkey type problem, because a big turkey has a lot more volume compared to its surface area, and it takes a lot longer to cook it. So, if you look at, there's another axis, there's another thing that people were unconscious of. And, one of my little hobbies is probability and statistics because I did my PhD in statistical thermodynamics, and I like that. I like looking at the world from a statistical point of view. And it turns out to be pretty important in space because it's all about reliability, isn't it? Because it costs $10,000 to put a kilogram up, you don't want it to fail because we don't know how to put another kilogram up to fix the first kilogram that we put up. If something breaks on the ground, you send it back to the manufacturer on FedEx and they send you a new one. It's not a big deal because the transportation cost is nothing. But in space, the transportation cost is generally more than the payload. And so if the payload breaks, it doesn't pay, to fix it. You just relaunch another one, when you get the chance. Anyway, the upper left graph was kind of the first 5 chapters of my Bible on, small satellites. And it was mostly lost on most people who don't get the math, right? But what I'm saying is, if you look at a part that's 99% reliable, more than 99% reliable, 99.9% reliable, the green line. And if you look at the green line, I'm up to 25 minutes, so I'm going to quit after this slide. If you only have one part like that, and your whole satellite has one part, your reliability is 99.9. If you have two parts and they both have to work, your reliability is 99.9 times 99.9, or 0.999 times 0.999 to do the math right? And that would be 0.998, roughly. Okay, so if you have 10 of those parts, 100 of those parts, 1,000 of those parts, if you take 0.999 to the 1,000th power, the overall reliability of having 1,000 parts, all of which have to work. And one of my engineers used to say, when people would ask him in a design review, what happens if that part fails? Does that cause the mission to fail? And, Richard Warner was his name, another Stanford guy who came to us from HP. Richard would say, we don't put parts in that we're not using. Which was the wrong answer. You're supposed to say, well, we lose that part, it isn't critical. But he was saying, I don't put parts in a satellite that aren't critical because, they're there for a reason. And so, okay, if you can't accept 0.4 and you need 1,000 parts, the Air Force's answer and NASA's answer was make higher reliability parts. So 99.99% reliable parts. So at 1,000, it's much more reliable. It's 90% reliable. We're talking about reliability in terms of part failure, right? But if you get an even bigger satellite, like that has 10,000 components, which is nothing, right? 10,000 transistors, 10,000 resistors, 10,000 stepper motors, however you want to, count it. A big satellite like that Ariane, mounted SPOT Image satellite has many more than 10,000 components on it. So maybe it has 100,000. The trouble with 100,000 is even if you could make parts that were 99.999% reliable, and this is pretty much the numbers for contemporary satellites, your probability that you are going to die of a part failure is about 2/3, which is unacceptable. So, there are two things that happen in the space world for which we're famous. One is parts reliability. The first thing that comes to mind if you play word association games with anybody about space is super reliability. Everything's got to be super reliable. It's got to be built in a clean room, blah, 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 because it's critical that it's all super reliable. For this reason, we got 100,000 working parts that all have to work. The other thing that most people know about space, and I'm a little bit this way in my general life, is redundancy. Right? Isn't redundancy the cure for part failure? I have two radios. No problem. If the radio fails, I will switch on the B-side radio. Well, Rick Fleeter, I had the opportunity to work on a satellite that was an A-side, B-side radio, and the computer failed in such a way that there was a radio failure, and the computer connected the working radio to the not antenna side of the switch and the non-working radio to the antenna, and the mission was basically over. And so there's a problem with redundancy, which is you have to manage it, right? If you look at the human body, what's the most critical things in your body that absolutely have to work? Like your heart and your brain, and they're not redundant, right? So what was nature thinking? They got it wrong? Is that, what we should learn from our body? That if we had two hearts, we could work much better. I think there were dinosaurs that had more than one heart, not for redundancy. They were just so big that it made sense to distribute the pumping problem. But that's another, that's a whole nother story, right? So redundancy is great, except that in order to have redundancy, you have to have a brain that decides which side it's going to work on. Then that brain has to be redundant because it could fail. So then you have voting systems, and actually modern jetliners have that. They have like 4 different flight computers, and then, of course, who arbitrates? How many of those computers vote yes and A side, and how many vote B side? It's fraught. Fraud is the word. How do I work this? What's the game? In order to not, have the decider, the adjudicator, mess up. I mean, it's the same problem that creates all the crises we have in our political system. If you don't trust this, then you go to that. If you don't trust that, then what do? Then you have, a revolution in your country because people don't believe in the system anymore. And, those things are crises for satellites. So there was this myth floating around that small satellites are not reliable because they're built by us radio amateurs on our kitchen tables. I mean, literally on our kitchen tables. And I was kind of a manager for AMSAT. I would travel around the country and go and visit the guy who was building the radio, the guy who was building the computer, the guy who was building the batteries. Inevitably, I would go to their house and there were kids and dogs and all kinds of stuff going on. And, we'd have dinner together and then they'd clear the dishes off the table and then he'd pull the satellite out of, the buffet server thing in the drawers where people normally keep their china. He had the satellite and, a piece of cloth to put it on and all of his tools. And they were kind of scrunched up in there. And then he put it out on the table and there might still be some breadcrumbs and et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, what do you think of this? And let me show you what I'm doing with that. And we flew that stuff and it worked. A 95% reliability, no clean room, all the parts were, bought at Radio Shack. How is that possible? Well, we had the reputation for building toys, but in reality, we were smarter than we knew we were because we had 10 parts in the damn thing. A lot of consumer electronics are that way. The manufacturers work very hard to reach high level of integration, they call it, which means I only need one chip. One chip runs my whole cell phone. That's good because if that one chip is only 99.9% reliable, which is pretty much a junk part in the space world anyway. I mean, it's a junk part even at Radio Shack, 99.9. Imagine, anyway, the probability of it failing is 1 in 1,000. And if 1 in 1,000 of your phones fails, just replace it. It doesn't pay to spend a fortune on that chip. You know what I mean? Because it's going to make all 1,000 of the phones more expensive. It's cheaper to just throw 1 in 1,000 away. We argued that and argued that and argued that. Finally, Iridium launched, built by Lockheed, and they said the same thing. We're not building redundant. We need too many satellites up there, 70. That was a big number back then. And then one failed on orbit. Oh, the press descended on Lockheed because they were like one of the big mainline space companies like TRW, like Northrop, like Hughes, and it was like, no, we're not allowed to fail in that world. That is the real world. Those stuff are multiple redundancy, clean rooms, gold plated, costs a fortune, but it works. And the stuff worked. TRW had never launched a failure. Never. And so, in 40 years in space. So Lockheed fails a satellite. And it was like a scandal. And the press went to, some program manager at Lockheed and said, are you going to totally change, have you learned your lesson, that you shouldn't build satellites like that? And the guy said, we haven't learned anything that would change our mind. What we learned was what we expected, that, our reliability numbers are not great, but it's cheaper to launch more satellites and let a few of them fail. We don't care. This is exactly according to our plan. That was the beginning, that was, a crack in the iceberg when a mainstream space company, took up that philosophy. So everybody can understand scale and they can look at that picture and they can say, yeah, I understand what a big satellite, what a small satellite is. But they don't understand that underneath that is certain scaling that's going on. That small is advantageous from a power point of view, not disadvantageous. Because of the simple thing that we all learn in heat transfer class, that linear goes linear, area goes linear squared, and volume goes linear cubed, and power goes like volume because that's how many circuits are in there, and power goes like surface area because that's how many solar panels you have, and therefore little satellites have plenty of power, and little satellites are highly reliable because they have no parts inside of them. They have 10 parts. That's what I'm saying about Sputnik. We could probably build it if we can get it done in the middle of COVID. I don't know. But it'll have no parts inside of it. Nowadays, we don't think of a part as a transistor. We might think of a part as a radio, because a radio is basically a chip with software. So we have one chip for the radio and a couple of other chips that run the satellite. That's what Ames did. They built the, Android satellite, which was a cell phone. When cell phones have very few parts on them. And they all worked. They were going out and buying $300 cell phones and operating on them at Ames to, pull off the screen and put on solar panels. And they were getting, fantastic reliability. And AMSAT, we didn't know anything. We were, a lot of the guys building satellites for AmSat work for NASA, quote unquote. Oh, you have guys who work for NASA. What were they doing for NASA? They were bureaucrats at NASA. They were working in finance. They wanted to have a chance to do space. And so they did it with AmSat. We weren't experts. I was a college kid. I didn't know anything, ham radio operator. And we didn't even know why they were reliable. The sad part of that story is we didn't know either. We were naive. It was just working. And, it was only later on in life, that I realized that we were lucky in a sense, because we were on the left side, of that curve. And the sad part of the story is that AmSat really didn't get that. And they wanted to build bigger and prove. They said, we're building 95% satellites. We're going to get bigger and show that we can do real stuff now. And they launched a big one, and I was against it because by then, I had, I'd eaten a little of the apple, and I was thrown out of the Garden of Eden. And I kept saying, I'm not very uncomfortable with building a 1,000-pound class satellite, 500 kilograms, in our living rooms. I just don't think it's a good idea. I think we're going to have problems. And, and I also just felt it was out of the scale of the kitchen table at that point. That's the thing. I don't criticize big satellite people. They have all these redundancies. They have all these gold-plated parts. They have clean rooms. They need it. If you're going to do a big mission, if you're going to do the Hubble Space Telescope, you need it. And it's totally appropriate. And that I'm not criticizing that technology at all. It's amazing. We're going to watch a film in this class, How to Build a Satellite. That's one thing that people mistook about me. They thought that I was that I was trashing the big satellite world. Not at all. I worked in the big satellite world. It's a miracle of technology. Just I say that about Facebook. Everybody likes to criticize Facebook. Facebook is a miracle of technology. It's a miracle that it works. It's fantastic. Just enjoy it, guy. Don't worry about it so much. We're lucky to live in a period when we have these things that human beings have been able to make them work is fantastic. But everything in its place. If all you want to do is flash a little strobe light in space to entertain people on the ground, you don't need that. And when you scale down, a little satellite is not a big satellite made miniature. It's a whole different technology. Bicycle is not a semi-tractor trailer. And the technologies do not really apply. How you build the bearings, how you build the gear shift, it's a totally different technological entity than the big thing. Okay, so I'm going to come back later with podcast 3, but this will be at least something to get you going. Talk to you later. Thanks for listening. Bye.